In the name of the one holy and living God, amen. So I wasn't really supposed to be here today and got this emergency phone call at 10 of 9. And so this will probably be the shortest thing you've ever heard me say, or the longest, it depends. So let me begin with a story. We bought our first house in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the dead of winter. And the dead of winter in Minnesota, even with climate change, this was a while ago, means that about February, you have this awful, nasty, crusty snow, about 2 feet of it, that just sort of sits there. But the house was charming inside, and it looked good outside, and we were really desirous of buying a house, so we did. So the time came for closing, and now the snow is melted. We've driven by several times. The front yard looks great. We move in. I'm hearing people go, uh-oh, already. The backyard, the two owners prior to us had put this incredible addition onto a classic Sears and Roebuck 4-square house. And the backyard still looked like it did when they finished that addition. There was even a piece of concrete sort of upright in it, like about this big. And we were really just like, oh dear. There was this gravel pit. So my husband set about loading up 10 wheelbarrows full of gravel. That's what it finally took. And taking them down the driveway, we had a detached garage, and it was weed filled behind it, so he just kept dumping the gravel on the weeds. And so it went. And eventually, we had a beautiful backyard with several gardens, and I ran into the previous owner's, the spouse, and asked kindly, "So tell me about the backyard." And her answer was, John only ever knew one green thing in his life, and that was the fairway of a golf course. Which just sort of explained everything, So we set about gardening as avid new gardeners for the very first time. And I can't tell you all the times we would go out and put seedlings in. And now do remember, even with climate change, that Minnesota has a growing season that's about this long. And so we're trying everything, including corn, which doesn't, it just does not, and potatoes and all that stuff. We go out to thin certain things, which you must do if you're growing carrots. Otherwise, they look very strange. And beets likewise. But other things, we're trying to sort of distinguish one thing and another, and sure enough, in one whole patch, we'd pulled up everything that was a vegetable and left all the weeds. You learn, gardening is one of those things that you only really learn by experience. And the first thing it taught me is the first thing I want you to know about this parable that it's saying to us. As a rule, we are really bad judges between what is wheat and what is weed. And to be honest, and I'll speak only for myself here, that also goes for people. I've met plenty of weeds in my life as people that turned out to be wheat, and plenty of what I thought was wheat turned out to be weeds. So that brings me to the second point I want to make about this parable. And that is that within each of us is a lot of weed and a lot of wheat growing together all the time. And on any given day, you'll hear one speak more than another, because that's just the way of being human. So there's a certain message in this parable about how we are to judge or not judge, as the case may be. There's also a certain lesson in this about who we may really be in the middle of all of this, which is why the owner of the field is not eager to pull up weeds just yet. And I have to say, much as I dislike, and we are very close to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Matthew right now, So everything that Jesus is going to say from here on out is just going to get harder and harder and harder. And the consequence of that is the allegorical tradition and interpretation of these parables just gets harder and harder and harder. I do want to say one thing. Evil is alive and well in this world just like it was in the ancient world. And I think if we believe in a just God, somehow evil has to be dealt with. So much as I don't like to think about or preach about or talk about fiery furnaces and outer darkness and gnashing of teeth, the reality is I want God to deal with evil. But I just assume that not be me. Thank you very much. So let's step away from that back to the parable about wheat and weeds. So if we have weeds and we have wheat growing in us, the most important message of this parable is that it is a parable of grace and of time. We don't have endless time, but we possibly have enough time in our lives to grow the wheat more than the weedy part of ourselves. And that's where our focus should be. It's on growing up that good wheat that God longs to harvest, that God actually believes is who we are at our most, not only best selves, but the self that God always imagines who we were to be the day we were born. So that's what we need to continue to encourage to grow, not only in ourselves, but in our community. Because in that lovely poetic passage from the letter to the Romans, where Paul says how much creation groans in travail for a wheat harvest, for a true harvest, for the true presence of God in us, we need to remember that that is not only creation's great longing, that is God's great longing as well. This past week, I had a wonderful opportunity to spend time with the vestry and walk them through a series of questions about vision, and a vision for St. John's from their perspective as your leaders. And I said after each question, when we were all done working all that material, that every question had a subtext. And the subtext for one of the questions that I love the most, which has to do with when you talk about church at its most magnificent, what would be the wishes of that church? I said, you know, those aren't just wishes. That's the dream of God. The dream of God. The dream of God for this place, this people, this mission, this ministry. What is the dream of God? I heard some magnificent things, by the way. But that is the thing to remember in this. God doesn't just wish we would be more wheat than weed. God dreams every moment of every day that that's what we are to be. And if God's dream counts for anything, we should give it space to prevail. We should give ourselves the time to grow into that dream, to be those children, to be that wheat and not the weeds. And that's simply what the invitation is today. We have time. God knows how much time, but I don't. But we have time. Time to grow into the dream of God as wheat. To be the people that God knows not only that we can be, but mostly looks at us and imagines we are. Because I always imagine God living in the eternal present. It's a little Buddhist of me, but there you go. God is here now. imagining us at our finest, because that's who God intends us to be. So my prayer for you this day is the invitation of this gospel. Not to be anxious to stuff out, weed away what you think isn't right, because like I said, what may be weedy may wind up being quite the wheat. And what you think is wheat may not be really very good at all. But instead, living into the imagination of God for each and every one of us and for this community as God's own, as wheat. Wheat, I pray, that will be harvested. And there'll be a little weediness around, but let's not worry about that. Let's just let God be God. Let that fall away. Amen.